Thank you, choir. It's beautiful. Teaching us, bless the Lord. Thank you so much. Lynn Kane stayed at home from work to take care of her 9-year-old son, John, who was sick with the flu. And late in the morning, the telephone rang. It was a physician at the local hospital. Lynn Kane's husband, John's father, was a patient at the hospital struggling with cancer. And the physician spoke these words to Lynn Kane. Miss Kane, your husband died this morning. It's funny, she said, all these years later, when the doctor said those 5 words, your husband died this morning, I don't remember anything. I don't remember what I did. I don't remember what I felt. I don't remember what I said. Years later, I asked my son, John, did I cry? And he said, no, Mama, you didn't. You were trying to be brave. Lynn Kane wrote about her experience, her suffering, losing her husband, and how she plunged into despair and grief. And the title of her book is Widow. This is the first line of the book. Being a widow is like living in a country where no one speaks your language. Most people who have experienced grief, who are experiencing grief, you know what she's talking about. To lose a spouse or a partner, a child, a parent, a loved one, is to enter the world of grief. It really is like living in a country where no one speaks your language. Now, there will be people who will try to speak your language. You know, they'll say things like, you're young, you can have another child. You're young, you can remarry. Huh? Look on the bright side, things will get better. It's their language, isn't it? But it's not yours. When William Sloane Coffin's son Alex, 24 years old, when he was killed in a terrible automobile accident, he said that he received cards and letters and phone calls from friends and acquaintances, all meaning well, but very few of them helpful. And he said some of the worst were from his fellow reverends, who proved by what they said that they knew more about the Bible than they did the human heart. Coffin said, I know all of the biblical passages. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Weeping endures for the night, but joy comes in the morning. I know all of the damn passages, he said. But my grief was so real. Their words were hollow. To enter into grief is like living in a country where no one speaks your language, or as Shakespeare might have paraphrased it, everyone knows how to heal grief except those who actually experience it. Which is why I've come to think that down through the centuries, the Psalms have been such a healing place of comfort for so many who experience grief. Out of the 150 Psalms, 73 of them are about grief. And they're written by people who don't keep grief at arm's length. No, they actually embrace it. They are actually living through and experiencing grief. In Psalm 77 that Julie so eloquently read to you this morning, the psalmist is full of anxiety and fear and despair. He is in turmoil. His spirit is one of a churning sea. And he doesn't just express his grief in one verse or 2 verses or 3. No, he goes on and on about his grief. Grief empties out of him in buckets. But then, in a moment of wisdom, When he is in acute grief, he makes this interesting decision, almost a decision of the will. It's like when he was in acute grief, he decides to remember who God is and what God has done in the past. He's angry at God, but at least now he has some perspective. Martin Luther once said, "We are often closest to God when we shake our fist at heaven, because when we do, we have to trust God." And it is in that trust, that angered trust, that the psalmist looks and remembers what God did in the Exodus when God rescued the children of Israel from slavery. And ironically, it is in that discussion that the psalmist discovers how he might be healed himself. The first thing he discovers is that Israel was not healed apart from the waters. They were healed in the midst of the churning waters through the sea. And the way that we move through grief is not to go around it or to push it away, but to go through it one tear at a time. Hans Küng once said, "God's love does not protect us from suffering. God's love protects us in the midst of our suffering." And when I listen to your stories, your grief stories, I'm listening for danger signals. I'm listening for those signals that might be a prelude to the lostness of your soul. I'm listening for the signals. Why me? Why she was so young? How can I ever trust God again? Those are the markers that lead to the destruction of our souls. And we forget that God is with us in the midst of our grief and our suffering. The second thing the psalmist discovers is that sometimes God helps in our grief through other people. The psalmist says, "We were saved by Moses and Aaron." Sometimes, folks, it is the people who are closest around us, our friends, our neighbors, people we meet on the street who become agents of God's healing for us in our grief. And sometimes, when we are trying to become agents of God's healing for others, even as we are experiencing grief, we find that we are healed as we help others. A woman was having difficulty getting over the loss of her husband. She went to her doctor and said, "Write me a prescription to help me deal with my sadness. I go to the cemetery every day. I bring flowers, place them on my husband's grave, and it's not helping. It only drives me deeper into grief. Give me something that will ease my pain." Her physician paused for a moment. And he finally said, "Before I write you a prescription, would you do me a favor? Instead of going to the cemetery every day, placing flowers on your husband's grave, would you bring the flowers to the hospital? I have patients that nobody visits." She resisted at first, but finally decided to do it. And it was in that decision that she found the beginning of the healing process. As she offered encouragement and joy to others, she was able to drink from the deep well of God's own encouragement. Finally, the psalmist discovers, as he looks at what God has done, sometimes our healing is hidden. Sometimes we are healed without even knowing it. Amen. The psalmist puts it this way: in the midst of the churning waters, God's footprints were not seen. God was healing, bringing redemption, bringing hope, but God could not be seen. How many of you know the name Charles de Gaulle? We all do. World War II hero, president of France. But did you know that Charles de Gaulle and his wife Yvonne were parents to a Down syndrome child, a daughter by the name of Anne? And regardless of what was happening in state affairs, de Gaulle would come home every evening to be with his wife and his daughter. And when they put their daughter Anne to bed, sometimes Yvonne would just cry. She said to her husband, Charles, I've prayed every day. Why can't Anne be like the others? Charles, why can't our daughter be like the others? Anne did not live to adulthood. The de Gaulles held a private graveside service, and at the service, the priest said these words, when Jesus died, all the world thought was suffering and death. But the hidden hand of God was at work, providing redemption and victory, just as the hidden hand of God is at work, bringing healing to Anne. When the service was over, Yvonne could not pull herself away from the graveside. Charles de Gaulle went to his wife, put his arms around her and said, come, Yvonne. Did you not hear what the priest said? Anne is now like the others. Folks, in the midst of our grief is the hidden hand of God.
Amen.
Someone who is fluent in the language of grief. My brother is grieving. His family is grieving. Torn apart. How will they survive? And I want to send this message to my brother. Do you think it's worth a stamp? Hidden God always with us. Amen.